Nuclear power is often advocated as the main option or one important option to tackle climate change. And this report is basically aiming for bringing an overall view of this issue by maybe putting together some facts and findings, most of them already existing, but maybe put together for the first time in such a way. The report proposes an analysis in three parts, which cover different issues but should be related. Being first the specific risks attached to the use of nuclear energy, which should never be forgotten when discussing it as an option in climate change policies. Second, the issue of the inherent efficiency of nuclear power to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And thirdly, the consistency of the nuclear option together with other options in an overall as effective and as fast delivering strategy as possible in the face of the climate urgency. So the first part is about the specific risks attached to the use of nuclear power, which are kind of unavoidable and which are mostly of three kinds. The first one being historically the nuclear proliferation issue, the fact that the same nuclear materials, the same technologies are used in civilian programs and could be used in military programs, and history told us how easy the transfer from one to the other is. So whenever introducing civilian use of nuclear energy somewhere, there's a risk of it being used as a cover for a military program. And we also know from the 50s that on top of one explosion of nuclear device being already a catastrophe in itself, the use in a global nuclear conflict of most of the existing nuclear arsenal could lead to a so-called nuclear winter scenario, which is a threat to humanity and has been one of the first reasons for humanity to understand that it could that it developed means which could destroy itself. The second important risk related to the use of nuclear power is, of course, the risk of a major accident on one or some reactors. We unfortunately have the evidence of Chernobyl and Fukushima about that. We know that the frequency of accident has been over 100 times more than the forecast of the nuclear safety theory. We know that these accidents have disastrous consequences on the populations concerned, on the territories contaminated for a very long time, on the economy of the countries. And we know that there are some factors which are currently increasing the risk, namely the aging of reactors, the economic pressure, the increase of natural aggressions, especially with climate change ongoing, and also, of course, the terror threat increasing. The third issue with nuclear risks is the accumulation of radioactive waste, the accumulation of radioactive discharges of contaminated sites, the whole issue of dismantling nuclear facilities. One important thing is that the most radioactive waste, the most dangerous one, has accumulated in every concerned countries with until now no no industrial solution to safely and definitely deal with it. In the perspective of climate change policies, what should be said is that first, these risks have grown with the development of nuclear power until now, and that they are bound to increase if nuclear power development is thought for tackling climate change. Industry has never provided until now a solution to eliminate this risk, so they will increase if the use of nuclear power is expanded, especially if it expands to new countries. The second area of analysis is the actual efficiency of nuclear power to curb greenhouse gas emissions based on evidence of what it contributed until now. And the first point is to recall that although the industry claims that nuclear power is a zero emission energy, this is not exactly true. The fact is that there are no direct CO2 emissions from nuclear power, but there are indirect life cycle emissions. And they are in the range of tens of grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is, of course, much less than the hundreds of grams of fossil fuels, but it's still in the same range as renewables. These indirect emissions compare with the emissions that are avoided by the use of nuclear power, and these emissions, of course, could not be directly measured. You need to introduce an assumption on what the use of nuclear power replaces to know how much emissions it avoids. Usually, the nuclear industry would use a very simple but biased assumption, that is, namely that every nuclear kilowatt hour replaces coal-based kilowatt hour. We use still conservative assumption, but more realistic, we think, which is to consider that every nuclear kilowatt hour is replaced or replacing the equivalent electric mix of the time. And therefore, the content of the avoided emissions due to nuclear power evolves with the content of the overall electric mix through time. This allows to draw an historical perspective of the contribution of nuclear power since it started in the 50s to limit or reduce emissions. And what we see is significant with 1.5 billion tons avoided nowadays, but very marginal impact compared to the overall trend of emissions, and especially compared to almost 30 billion tons added in world emissions since nuclear power started. In other terms, the development of nuclear power never allowed to change the trend in this strong increase of world emissions, and therefore nuclear power rather appears as a component of this energy system from the past, which led to that climate change problem, than an alternative to this system. When we look more closely at the nuclear contribution to avoided emissions, we see that this contribution peaked actually 15 years ago in 2000 with 6% of avoided emissions due to nuclear power, and this went down since to 4%, mostly because nuclear power is stagnant. There are no new development in capacities, and therefore it contribution to the world electricity is decreasing, and it is now just above 10% of world electricity. Another important thing to mention when talking about the efficiency of nuclear power to reduce emission is its inherent restricted range of action, mostly because it only addresses CO2 emissions from electricity, and this is only a part of CO2 emissions related to energy use, and this is still even only a part of all greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors. This limitation is very much illustrated by the French example, where nuclear power has been developed at its maximum, close to 80% of French electricity. And we can see, when we look at energy-related CO2 emissions since the 70s, that this introduction of nuclear power, mostly in the 70s and 80s, contributed roughly to 15% decrease of French greenhouse gas emissions. And the most important is that this decrease, although very significant, is limited and couldn't go further, and didn't bring French emissions down enough. French overall greenhouse gas emissions remain, after nuclear power has been developed to its maximum, at a level which is roughly 4 times the sustainable level. So we see that a comprehensive and effective climate change policy needs much more, or something really different than pushing nuclear power that far. This brings me to the third part of the analysis, which addresses the consistency of including nuclear power as an option in an overall climate change policy. It is useful to recall, to start with, that it could only be a minor role, because simply because a major role is completely out of reach. A major role would mean multiplying by 5 or 10 the number of nuclear reactors in the world, and this is simply impossible in the next decades, which is when action is badly needed. So we are only talking of minor role, and we have some scenarios which illustrate what this could be. For instance, the scenarios which are reference ones of the International Energy Agency, and these scenarios allow to assess the possible share of nuclear power in a global reduction of emissions down to a more sustainable level. And this share would not be more than 10%, much less than energy efficiency and much less than renewables. And even though this 10% could only be obtained through a very, very strong effort to develop the nuclear fleet. Just to illustrate this, it would mean basically to develop and maintain a level of new reactors construction for the next 20 years, up to the up to the peak of nuclear constructions that we had in the in the 80s at the peak of the development of the existing fleet. And this, in current industrial financial conditions, seems simply highly unrealistic. So in other words, even a minor role for nuclear power seems a major challenge. It is surprising in a way that the official scenario still shows so much confidence in nuclear power and much less confidence in renewables. This is increasingly opposite to the dynamics of those industries, which is, for instance, illustrated by a few figures of the comparison worldwide. Renewables, electric renewables, currently provide 5 times more installed capacity than nuclear power. It provides twice more electricity worldwide, and maybe the most significant figure, because it tells you a lot about the future electric system, is the fact that for more than the past 10 years, renewables have gathered more than 10 times the investments in nuclear reactors. And this is for a very good reason, which is basic economics. Because on one hand, nuclear power costs have been escalating, while on the other hand, the costs of renewables are dramatically decreasing. The whole history of nuclear power has been one of constantly growing costs. This is, for instance, illustrated by the French case, where the construction cost of new reactors has always increased in a kind of negative learning curve. And this is also illustrated by new projects. Roughly everywhere in the world, nuclear reactors being constructed are delayed, are see escalating costs, and this is especially illustrated by the 3 projects of EPR reactors proposed by France and being constructed in France, Finland, and projected in the UK. And when you look at these figures, it's increasingly obvious that nuclear power is less and less competitive compared to both renewables and energy efficiency in terms of emissions saved by euro or by dollar invested. The comparison is clearly very much in favor of renewables and efficiency, and therefore any new reactor project would actually substitute to existing faster, cheaper, and more effective options. There's practically no situation in the world today where climate change could be the justification of new reactors, because there's always something more effective and more relevant in economic terms to do to achieve the same or greater emission savings. This practically rules out new reactors from effective climate change policies, and the only question that remains is that of existing reactors. This is a more difficult question, because you could discuss how much existing reactors could play a role in energy transition, but it's kind of well illustrated by the comparison between the case of Germany and the case of France. The German energy policy is very often heavily criticized, especially in France, for favoring a new development of coal to allow for nuclear phase-out. This is actually a very biased description of what is ongoing in Germany, which is really different. First of all, the German overall greenhouse gas emissions are clearly on decreasing trend, and I mean the trajectory is consistent with German mid-term and long-term objectives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So there's no question about that. The only question is about the consistency of what Germany is doing with its electric system. And again, what we see is a very consistent way of implementing a fast but sound change, in-depth change of the electric system. Firstly, based on electricity conservation, which was rather slow to develop, but which is now bringing its fruits, and we see a decrease of German electric consumption. And secondly, by developing renewables, but in a clever way, which is roughly to first phase out nuclear to give some space to the development of renewables, which in turn will allow for phasing out coal plants. And this is consistent with the fact that you can't add up all capacities in an electric system. You have some combinations which work and some which don't, and especially the combination of nuclear, baseload nuclear power and variable renewables is not working, and therefore the evolution of the German electric system is shows very consistently how the transformation could be implemented for the long term. In contrast, we have the case of France, where nuclear power has been so much developed that is now slowing or even forbidding the required development of renewables in the electric system. When we look at long-term scenarios of energy transition in France, which means scenarios aiming for this fourfold reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which is needed in the long term, there are two major lessons to draw. The first one is that this won't happen without strong action on energy demand. The lesson from scenarios is that to reach fourfold reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, we need roughly a twofold reduction of our final energy consumption, and this is no commitment of France, which introduced this in its energy transition law. The second lesson is that, contrary to what the nuclear industry would want us to believe, it's actually by reducing the role of nuclear power or even phasing out nuclear power that France could reach this fourfold reduction objective. And the reason for that is it is when you reduce or phase out nuclear power that you allow for the kind of in-depth transformation of the energy system that is the key for reducing greenhouse gas emissions to the required level. In other words, the French situation and French energy scenarios show how much existing nuclear power could be, instead of an asset, an obstacle to in-depth transformation of the energy system, and therefore an obstacle to fast delivering consistent action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We also have evidence in France now that, based on a study by ADEME especially, that this vision of 100% renewables in the electric system for the long term is both technically and economically feasible. There's no obstacle for this deep change of the electric system. And we also know from various studies that such a transformation, this energy transition, is actually an opportunity in economic and social terms. It brings employments, it brings reduction of the French energy bill. So it's not only good for, it's not only needed as a climate change policy, but it's also a strong economic opportunity to seize. This brings me to the conclusion of this analysis. The first one is that there are specific risks attached to the use of nuclear power, and that these risks would increase if the use of nuclear power is expanded to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, ways to better address these risks should be considered when discussing this option. The second conclusion is that when it comes to the efficiency of nuclear power to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to acknowledge that it's been very limited until now, that it is declining, and that it is bound to remain limited, at least for one reason, which is the restricted range of action of nuclear power when it comes to overall greenhouse gas emissions. The third conclusion is about the consistency of including or not nuclear power in an overall strong climate change policy. Given the urgency, it's not about adding all possible solutions, but it's really about combining the most effective solutions in the most consistent way. Compared to energy efficiency and renewables, nuclear power could only pretend to a minor role, complementary to those options which are mostly needed. And in fact, it turns out that when you compare a project of a new reactor to what these options could deliver, new reactors are never the cheapest or most effective or fastest to develop solutions. So, in other words, there are no situations where new nuclear reactors could be justified as part of a sound climate change policy. Moreover, when it comes to existing nuclear reactors, they are actually slowing in-depth energy transition and therefore appear more as an obstacle to the development of up-to-scale and fast enough climate change policies than an asset in those policies.